Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Eniagulda. Now let's head out to space and deploy to a vast new frontier, because having been likened to Star Trek, the US Space Force, the latest military might to be signed into play by President Trump, and the first military addition apparently since 1947, has come under some heavy skepticism, satire and ridicule. But the Space Force, tasked with missions and operations in the rapidly evolving space domain, has just made its first deployment to a final frontier of sorts. No, they're not in space, but the Arabian Peninsula. So what's a Space Force doing there, and is it really needed? We'll speak to our correspondent about this in a moment. But first, here's a video about the new Space Force produced by the US Air Force.
Some people look to the stars and ask, what if? Our job is to have an answer. We have to imagine what will be imagined. Plan for what's possible while it's still impossible. Maybe you weren't put here just to ask the questions. Maybe you were put here to be the answer. Maybe your purpose on this planet isn't on this planet.
And that video is courtesy of the US Air Force. Well, our correspondent Karl Bostic has been taking a look at the new US Space Force, and he joins me now in the studio. Great to see you, Karl. What do these space experts or members of the Space Force do primarily? Because they're clearly not in space, are they?
Well, ironically, Charles, despite people taking shots at it with a skeptical view or even a comic view. For example, people aren't even sure, what do you call a member of the U.S. Space Force? If you belong to the Navy, you're a sailor. If you belong to the Army, you're a soldier. So what do you call a member of the Space Force? A spaceman? Not exactly. And even the uniforms of those people, that first squadron of 20 people who are now in the Arabian Desert, they're wearing camouflage outfits. Well, I don't think you need camouflage outfits to be in outer space. But that gets to the heart of what they're doing. The initial purpose being that I think it's important just to consider what's at stake. What's this new domain that we should be talking about, Charles? And quite frankly, if you go into outer space, it's becoming a crowded place filled with thousands and thousands of satellites. We have a slide we can show you just how crowded it is. It's one where we see how, despite the U.S. having a dominant position of satellites in outer space with more than 1,000, followed by Russia and China, with the rest of the world as well, that's being called the Achilles heel of U.S. military power, because with increasing threats in outer space, they're actually much more vulnerable, and there's not much to do about it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We've got more than 1,000 satellites in outer space, relied on by the U.S. for civilian and military purposes. And one thing to keep in mind, Charles, is that it affects every part of our daily life, from using GPS systems to track your shipment, to track your mail, even to track flights that you're supposed to be taking. But for military purposes, it's even more serious. I mean, when you had the first Gulf War back in 1990s, in 91, they used military satellites to tell U.S. military units where they were in the Arabian Desert. Otherwise, they would have gotten lost in trying to find Kuwait. So those kinds of things are at stake. But in terms of, so my point is that this is already always an existing need as long as these satellites were in outer space. That's why if you look at the U.S. Bureaucracy right now, Charles, you actually already had many of these tasks divided over multitudes of agencies in the U.S. If we look at this other slide coming up, we can see how we have these tasks divided by as many as 60 different agencies, Charles. And so the idea is ultimately to have 16,000 belonging to the Space Force. Already there's even talk about creating an undergraduate course for the Space Force in one of the military schools. So that's where we are right now.
That's very interesting, because I mean, the question which you've answered really was, is the space threat any greater? Because U.S. officials contend that it is, and you're obviously, with your sort of analysis there, you're supporting that fact. Because last month, I mean, we had U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper warning that Russia and China were developing weapons that could knock out U.S. satellites, scattering dangerous debris across space, paralyzing mobile phones, weather forecasts, drones, maybe even fighter jets. I mean, he's saying, that the threat is growing.
That's right, Charles. And in fact, if we look at this other slide coming up, we can break down those threats into basically 4 categories, beginning with what you reference. For example, in terms of a direct attack, what they're most worried about, for which there's no protection about, is the ability of a satellite to defend itself if it's directly attacked by a ballistic missile. Okay, that's never happened before. But already there are indications that Russia and China are testing out their ability to fire missiles at another satellite in outer space. That's what they're worried about, that sort of strategic threat. But there's also the indirect threat, Charles, where satellites are vulnerable to what they call non-kinetic acts, such as use of lasers and microwaves that can take them out. Thirdly, how radio signals can be jammed or satellite downlinks can be spoofed. What spoofing means is this: let's say you're a plane or a ship and you see communications. Well, maybe it's a false communication, but it's been copied or spoofed, if you will. And then lastly, there are those cyber attacks that can disrupt the links between ground stations and satellites. That's through hacking, sophisticated hacking. And all of those threats can be carried out by a very small club of countries that the U.S. is extremely worried about.
So, I mean, given what you're saying, are things returning to the way they were during the Cold War, when you had the US and the Soviet Union both developing anti-satellite weapons and had tested and deployed them, and there was this real notion of space being contested? I mean, we thought all of that had gone away with the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, you covered the Soviet Union.
Yes, but it's no longer a Cold War, Charles. If anything, it's a war that's now kind of been fragmented, because you have 3 or 4 possible actors. If we look at those countries which pose the greatest threats, Russia is a big strategic threat because they've shown the ability to fire a missile in outer space. It's the first known case of a space-based weapons test. Never happened before. In fact, what's also really concerning to U.S. experts is that it launched a satellite into space, Charles, several months ago, and then that satellite split up into 2. And then it shadowed a U.S. spy satellite. And then one of them even fired into space. So we're not talking about a Star Trek situation. And you could say that the modern space race actually began when China in 2007 fired from the ground a missile to take out one of its weather satellites, just to see if it could knock out a satellite from the ground in 2007. And that sent alarm bells ringing in the Pentagon. But the more immediate threat, quite frankly, is a country like Iran. Iran is still really an infant in this, but it's an immediate threat because of the rising escalations. This spring earlier, for example, Charles, they successfully launched their first satellite into space. U.S. officials were actually kind of mocking it. They're saying all it is really just a webcam in outer space that can't do anything. But the problem is, it shows that they may be trying to use what they claim is a peaceful development of satellite technology, which could be used for military uses. So to give an example of what the most immediate threat could be, if tensions continue to rise between Iran and the U.S., especially with sanctions maybe being reimposed, don't forget that the Strait of Hormuz in the Arabian, in the Persian Gulf, 20% of the world's oil supplies. The idea is to prevent collisions and accidents between commercial ships and military vessels. Well, suppose Iran is able to jam those communications, and suppose a ship that thinks that it's in safe waters when actually it's in Iranian waters, and Iran says, well, sorry, you're in our waters and we can seize your ship. Those are threats like that. So they're worried about how to protect a satellite in outer space, and they're also worried about how to warn a ship or a vessel or a plane, be careful, you're now in Iranian airspace or Iranian waters. And that's why they want to consolidate all these units into the U.S. Space Force. But one thing they need to get right, Charles, is 2 things maybe, is to get a proper uniform and to get a proper name, if you remember the Space Force.
Okay, we've got about 30 seconds before we have to go. If the deployment of the Space Force signals a sort of return to paranoia about, between countries, Russia, Iran, and so on and so forth, does that make the world more or less secure? And we've got about 10 seconds.
Well, I think it just means that this is another possible front for conflict in outer space, for which there's no treaty, and that's the problem. There's no treaty to prevent the use of weapons in outer space.
Well, I have to say it sounds worrying. But Karl, thank you very much indeed. I was rather hoping we were going to be talking about Star Trek, but alas, Karl Bostic. Well, that's it for this edition of The Arise Interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and Washington. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.